A woman was pronounced dead for 17 hours only to wake up screaming a horrifying message about the afterlife. Eliza had been declared gone by every doctor in the room, her pulse and breath gone without a trace. But when her body suddenly jerked awake, her screams echoed louder than anything they'd ever heard. What did she say that sent shivers down everyone's spine, leaving them fearful? Tune in as we uncover her chilling warning that made Pope Francis call for a private gathering with all religious leaders around the world. The calm before the storm hits. Eliza was a creature of habit. At 28, her life revolved around her job as a graphic designer, her cat named Whiskey, and her weekly yoga class with her best friend, Mara. She loved the predictability, the simplicity. People often said her life seemed small, but to her, it was peaceful. She didn't need grand adventures or wild parties. Yet, in the past few weeks, she'd felt an itch she couldn't scratch, like her life was about to change. Not in a good way either. It was a weight in her chest, growing heavier with each passing day. Before we dive deeper into Eliza's story, it's clear that the truth behind her growing unease is far darker than anyone could have imagined, and this is just the beginning of what will leave you speechless. She shook off the thought as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Whiskey, the lazy tabby, stretched on the couch and gave her a disinterested glance. "Must be nice to be a cat," she muttered, but even her own voice sounded strange, like it was coming from somewhere far away. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:15. The hand seemed to shiver just for a moment, and then everything was still again. The strange feelings had started a week ago. It began with the dreams, always the same. She was walking through a dense forest, the kind where the trees seemed to stretch endlessly upward, blocking out the sky. Shadows moved just out of sight, and a voice called her name, soft but insistent. She never reached the source of the voice. She always woke up drenched in sweat before she could. During the day, things weren't much better. Lights flickered in her apartment, even though the building manager swore there were no electrical issues. Once her phone rang, displaying a number that didn't make sense, all zeros. When she answered, there was nothing but static on the other end. And then there were the whispers. She'd be sitting at her desk or brushing her teeth, and suddenly she'd hear them, faint and fleeting. They always stopped the moment she tried to listen closely. "You're just stressed," Mara had said over dinner the night before. "It's probably just your brain playing tricks on you." Maybe she was right, but deep down, Eliza knew it was more than that. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. Today was no exception. As she got ready for work, the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. She stepped out of her apartment and onto the bustling city street, but even the familiar sights and sounds couldn't shake the unease that clung to her. People moved past her, their faces blurred and distant, like she was seeing them through frosted glass. A sudden chill ran down her spine, making her shiver despite the warm morning sun. At the office, things felt no better. Her co-workers greeted her, but their voices seemed muffled, as if she were underwater. Her computer screen flickered, displaying a brief image of something she couldn't quite make out before returning to normal. She blinked, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. As the day wore on, the strange occurrences escalated. Files she swore she had saved vanished from her computer. Her coffee cup moved across her desk when she wasn't looking. By lunch, she felt like she was losing her mind. She texted Mara, hoping for some reassurance, but the message wouldn't send. The signal bars on her phone were full, yet the device claimed there was no connection. She put her phone down, her hands trembling slightly. By the time she got home that evening, she was exhausted. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, closing her eyes. The silence of her apartment felt different tonight. It wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. Whiskey wasn't on the couch where she usually found him. "Whiskey?" she called out, no response. She found him hiding under the bed, his green eyes wide with fear. He didn't move when she reached out to pet him, and that's when she noticed it. The room had grown colder, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. Her breath came out in small puffs of mist. She stood up, her heart pounding, and looked around the room. Everything was still, but it felt wrong, like the air itself was watching her. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind, but there was no wind inside her apartment. It came from behind her, and when she turned, she saw nothing but her reflection in the mirror. Yet, for a split second, she could have sworn her reflection had moved just a fraction of a second slower than she had. Panic set in. She grabbed her phone intending to call Mara, but the screen wouldn't turn on. It was as if the device was completely dead. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 9:32. The hands were spinning wildly, faster and faster, until they stopped abruptly at midnight. The room plunged into darkness as the lights flickered and died. Eliza froze, her breath catching in her throat. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, filling the room with their eerie chorus. She stumbled backward, her legs trembling until she hit the wall. The air felt thicker now, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The lights flickered back on, the clock resumed its steady ticking, and the room was quiet. Eliza stood there, her body trembling, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know how long she stayed like that, but eventually she forced herself to move. She crawled into bed, pulling the covers over her head like a child, hiding from the monsters under the bed. But the monsters weren't under the bed. They were everywhere. As she lay there, trying to calm her racing heart, a sudden wave of exhaustion washed over her. Her eyelids grew heavy, and despite the fear coursing through her veins, she fell asleep. Her dreams were no better than the waking nightmare she had just experienced. The forest was back, darker and more oppressive than before. The voice called her name again, louder this time, more insistent. When she woke up, it was still dark. She glanced at the clock on her nightstand. 12:01. She had only been asleep for a few minutes, but it felt like hours. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't move. A heavy weight pressed down on her chest, pinning her to the bed. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. In the corner of the room, a shadow moved. It wasn't the kind of shadow cast by light. It was darker, denser, almost solid. It crept closer, its shape shifting and twisting as it approached. Eliza's heart raced, each beat louder than the last. And then, just as it reached her bedside, she felt it, a cold hand on her arm, pulling her down, down, down into the darkness. And then there was nothing. The call came in at exactly 12:02. Paramedics rushed to Eliza's apartment, their sirens piercing through the quiet streets. The neighbors peeked out of their windows, watching the commotion unfold with uneasy curiosity. By the time the emergency team arrived, the scene inside was eerily calm. The apartment was silent, except for the faint ticking of a clock, its hand stuck at 12:01. Eliza lay motionless on her bed, her face pale and expressionless. One paramedic leaned over her, checking for signs of life. "No pulse," he muttered, his voice tight, but something about her appearance made him hesitate. Her body wasn't cold, as it should have been. Instead, it was unnaturally warm, as if she had just fallen asleep. They worked quickly, performing CPR, administering shocks from a defibrillator. Nothing. The clock on the wall, still stuck at 12:01, seemed to mock their efforts. After 20 minutes, the lead paramedic called it. Time of death, 12:35. Eliza's body was taken to the hospital, where doctors examined her, searching for an explanation. Her heart had stopped, her brain showed no activity, and yet her skin retained a strange warmth. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus, frowned as he looked over the charts. "It doesn't make sense," he said to the nurse. "She's dead, but her body isn't showing the usual signs of death." Meanwhile, Mara arrived at the hospital, her face streaked with tears. She had been the one to alert the paramedics after receiving a frantic voicemail from Eliza earlier that evening. She replayed it over and over in her mind, Eliza's voice trembling as she said, "Something's wrong, Mara. I think it's here." The message had ended abruptly, leaving Mara with an overwhelming sense of dread. In the waiting room, Mara paced back and forth, clutching her phone tightly. Eliza's parents arrived soon after, their faces pale and stricken. Mrs. Reed's sobs echoed through the sterile halls, while Mr. Reed sat silently, staring at the floor. No one could comprehend what had happened. Eliza had been healthy, full of life. How could she be gone? As the hours passed, the hospital grew quieter. The staff moved with hushed efficiency, their footsteps barely audible against the polished floors. In the room where Eliza's body lay, the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. The clock on the bedside table had stopped at 12:01, the same as the one in her apartment. Dr. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He returned to the room to double-check the charts, only to find the monitors displaying faint, irregular blips. His heart raced as he called for assistance. Nurses flooded the room, their faces a mix of confusion and urgency. But just as quickly as the blips appeared, they vanished, leaving the monitors blank once more. "What's happening?" one nurse whispered, her voice trembling. No one had an answer. Back in the waiting room, Mara felt a sudden chill. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake off the cold that seemed to seep into her bones. The vending machine in the corner flickered, its lights dimming before shutting off completely. The clock on the wall ticked erratically, its hands jerking forward and back as if caught in some unseen struggle. Mara glanced around, her unease growing. Eliza's parents sat together, their grief palpable. Mrs. Reed clung to her husband, her body racked with sobs. "She's our baby," she kept repeating, her voice hoarse. Mr. Reed's hands trembled as he held his wife, his own tears silently streaming down his face. They couldn't accept it. How could they, when there was no warning, no explanation? As dawn approached, the hospital remained in an eerie state of limbo. Staff whispered about the odd occurrences, lights flickering, equipment malfunctioning, and the strange warmth that lingered in Eliza's body. Some chalked it up to stress and coincidence, while others exchanged nervous glances, too afraid to voice their thoughts. At 7 o'clock, the coroner arrived to transport Eliza's body to the morgue. But when they tried to move her, they found her body unyielding, as if she had become part of the bed itself. The coroner frowned, muttering something about rigor mortis, though the timing didn't align. It took 4 people to lift her onto the stretcher, their efforts met with an unnatural resistance. In the morgue, the strangeness continued. The temperature, usually kept cold to preserve bodies, inexplicably rose. The overhead lights buzzed loudly before shutting off entirely, plunging the room into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, Eliza's body appeared to have shifted slightly, though no one had touched her. Dr. Marcus, unable to ignore the mounting unease, decided to return to the morgue. As he approached the door, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound like breathing. He froze, his hand hovering over the handle. Gathering his courage, he pushed the door open. The room was silent, the sound gone. But as he stepped closer to the table where Eliza's body lay, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Her chest rose and fell, almost imperceptibly, as if she were drawing shallow breaths. He stumbled back, his mind racing. It wasn't possible. She had been declared dead hours ago, yet there she was, lying perfectly still, but undeniably alive in some unnatural way. Word of the incident spread quickly among the staff, though they tried to keep it from the grieving family. Mara, however, felt the tension in the air and demanded answers. She cornered a nurse in the hallway, her voice sharp. "What's going on? Tell me the truth." The nurse hesitated, her eyes darting around nervously. "I don't know," she whispered, "but something isn't right." As the 17th hour since Eliza's collapse approached, the hospital seemed to hold its breath. The clocks had all stopped at different times, their hands frozen in defiance of reality. The air grew heavier, the kind of oppressive stillness that made every sound feel amplified. And then, at exactly 5:01, the monitors in the morgue beeped once, breaking the silence. Dr. Marcus, who had been keeping a vigil near Eliza's body, jumped at the sound. He stared at the screen, watching as a faint heartbeat appeared. It was slow, irregular, but unmistakably there. He leaned in closer, his breath fogging the cold air. Her eyes remained closed, her body still, but the impossible had happened. Eliza had returned, or something had returned in her place. As Eliza steps into a strange new world, get ready to see a place that seems impossible, but somehow feels like it was meant for her. A place beyond understanding. Awareness returned, not with a jolt, but with a strange, quiet clarity. She wasn't in her apartment, nor was she in the hospital room. Instead, she found herself standing in a vast, glowing expanse that defied comprehension. The ground beneath her feet shimmered like molten gold, but it felt cool and solid. The air carried a soft hum, a sound that wasn't quite music, yet resonated deep within her, both comforting and unsettling. She looked around, her breath catching in her throat. Above her stretched the sky like a living canvas, swirling with colors she had no name for. Not quite blue, not quite purple, but something beyond both. Shadowy figures drifted in the distance, their movements slow and deliberate. They weren't entirely human. Their forms were elongated, their faces blurred as though veiled by smoke. Despite their strangeness, they exuded an undeniable presence, one that made her stomach churn. As she took a hesitant step forward, the hum in the air grew louder, shifting into something almost like whispers. The words were indecipherable, a language that seemed ancient and alien, yet she felt an instinctual understanding. It was as if the whispers were speaking directly to her soul, bypassing her ears entirely. Her feet moved without her consent, guiding her toward a towering structure in the distance. It rose like a monolith, its surface covered in glowing runes that shifted and writhed as if alive. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to resist her. It grew thicker, pressing against her body, making each step a struggle. Yet, she couldn't stop. Something was calling her, pulling her closer with an invisible force. As she approached the base of the structure, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was taller than any person she had ever seen, its body cloaked in shimmering dark fabric that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its face was obscured, but its eyes, if they could be called that, shone like twin stars, piercing and cold. When it spoke, its voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "You do not belong here," it said, though the words didn't reach her ears, but seemed to form directly in her mind. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Before she could gather herself, the figure raised an elongated hand and pointed past her. She turned to see what it was indicating and froze. The glowing expanse had shifted. Where once there had been an endless horizon of light and beauty, there was now a vast dark chasm. The ground on the other side of the chasm flickered like static on a broken screen, and the shadowy figures she had seen earlier were now gathered at its edge. They moved erratically, their limbs jerking in unnatural motions, their blurred faces twisting as if in pain or rage. Fear clawed at her, but she couldn't look away. The figures seemed to sense her gaze and turn toward her in unison. Their movements became more frantic, and one by one, they began to step into the chasm, their forms dissolving into the darkness as they fell. The sight filled her with a deep primal dread, but she couldn't understand why. The figure behind her spoke again, its voice heavier this time. "You are at the threshold. Choose wisely." Before she could ask what it meant, the ground beneath her feet began to shift. It wasn't a violent movement, but a slow, deliberate rearranging, as if the landscape itself was alive and testing her. She stumbled, struggling to keep her balance as the glowing ground gave way to something rougher, darker. She looked down and realized she was standing on what appeared to be the roots of an enormous tree, its twisted limbs stretching into the void below. The whispers returned, louder this time, and she realized they were coming from the tree itself. Its surface was covered in faces, human-like but warped and distorted. They moved as they whispered, their mouths forming words she couldn't understand. She reached out to touch one of the roots, and the moment her fingers made contact, a surge of memories flooded her mind, memories that weren't hers. She saw flashes of lives lived and lost, of joy and despair, of beginnings and endings. The emotions were overwhelming, hitting her like a tidal wave. She pulled her hand back, gasping for breath, but the visions lingered, etched into her mind like scars. The cloaked figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. This is the crossing. Few are allowed to pass. Fewer still return. Her chest tightened. What happens if I cross? She thought, not expecting an answer. But the figure seemed to hear her thoughts and replied, "You will see what lies beyond, but not all who see can bear it." The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, each one vying for her attention. They spoke of choices, of consequences, of paths not taken. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it did nothing to block the sound. She felt herself being pulled toward the chasm, her body moving of its own accord. Panic set in as she tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. As she neared the edge, the ground beneath her feet crumbled away, leaving her teetering on the brink. She looked down and saw nothing but endless darkness, a void that seemed to consume everything it touched. The shadowy figures were gone, swallowed by the abyss, but their whispers lingered, echoing in her mind. "You are not ready," the cloaked figure said, its voice cutting through the noise like a blade. It raised its hand, and suddenly the pull stopped. She stumbled backward, collapsing onto the rough, root-covered ground. She looked up at the figure, her chest heaving. "Why am I here?" she thought, and again, the figure seemed to hear her. "You were pulled too soon. The veil between worlds is thin, but it is not yet your time to cross." The ground beneath her began to glow again, the light spreading like fire through the twisted roots. The air grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. She looked around, her fear giving way to confusion. The chasm was still there, but its edges seemed less defined, as if it were retreating. The cloaked figure stepped back, its form dissolving into the glowing landscape. "You must return," it said, its voice fading. "But remember, the crossing is always there, waiting." Before she could process the words, the light around her intensified, blinding her. She felt a sudden rush, as if she were being pulled upward, and then she was gone. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the hospital room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the steady beep of a heart monitor filled the air. She blinked, disoriented, her body heavy and weak. The faces of her loved ones came into focus, their expressions a mix of relief and disbelief. But deep down, she knew the truth. She hadn't escaped the crossing. She had only been given a reprieve. Eliza is about to face things that will test everything she thought she knew about life, death, and what lies beyond. The path to saving the world revealed. Eliza's consciousness returned like the slow turning of a key in a lock. This time, she wasn't in the glowing expanse or the hospital room. She was somewhere entirely different, a place that felt ancient, primordial, as though it had existed before time itself. The ground beneath her was cold and slick, a dark stone veined with glowing cracks that pulsed like a heartbeat. The air was thick with a metallic tang, and each breath felt heavy in her chest. She stood in a vast cavern, its ceiling hidden by an impenetrable darkness. Massive pillars of jagged stone rose around her, their surfaces etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when she tried to focus on them. A faint light emanated from the cracks in the ground, casting long, flickering shadows that danced like living things. Somewhere in the distance, a low, guttural sound reverberated, sending shivers down her spine. And then she saw it. At the center of the cavern, perched atop a throne carved from what looked like bone, was a figure unlike anything she had ever imagined. It was immense, towering over her even while seated. Its form was shrouded in a tattered black cloak that seemed to ripple and breathe, as if alive. The cloak obscured most of his body, but what little she could see was monstrous. Its hands were skeletal, the fingers unnaturally long and tipped with claws that gleamed like obsidian. The figure's face was hidden beneath a hood, but two glowing orbs burned where its eyes should have been. They radiated a cold, piercing light that seemed to see through her, stripping away every layer of pretense and leaving her exposed. The air around the figure seemed to hum with a terrible energy, a presence so overwhelming it made her knees buckle. "Eliza," the figure intoned, its voice a deep, resonant growl that seemed to echo from the very core of the earth. It spoke her name with a weight that made her heart race. She didn't know how it knew her, but there was no mistaking its authority. This being wasn't just powerful, it was ancient, primordial, and utterly beyond her comprehension. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. The figure raised one clawed hand, and the cavern seemed to tremble in response. "You stand at the edge of a precipice," it said, the words rumbling through the air like thunder. "Your world teeters on the brink of ruin, and yet humanity walks blindfolded into the abyss." As it spoke, images began to form in the air around it, flickering like projections on a screen. Eliza saw scenes of devastation, cities swallowed by rising seas, forests consumed by fire, and fields turned to barren wastelands. She saw people scrambling in chaos, their faces twisted with fear and desperation. The images were vivid, so real she felt as though she could reach out and touch them. "This is the path your kind has chosen," the figure continued, its tone sharp and unforgiving. "Greed has poisoned the earth. Hubris has shattered the balance. You consume without thought, build without purpose, and destroy without remorse." Eliza's chest tightened as the weight of the words sank in. The images shifted, now showing flashes of what could only be described as ancient civilizations. Towering structures of stone and glass, surrounded by lush landscapes, appeared and then vanished as quickly as they came. The figure's voice softened, though its intensity remained. "Others have walked this path before," it said. "They too ignored the warnings. They too believed they were invincible, and they too fell." The flickering images showed these civilizations crumbling, their great monuments reduced to rubble. Eliza felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The figure's glowing eyes held her captive, forcing her to witness the destruction. "But it is not too late," the figure said, its voice shifting to something almost resembling hope. "There is still a chance to turn back, to restore the balance that has been lost. But the cost will be great and the burden heavy. Few will have the strength to bear it." Eliza found her voice, though it trembled as she spoke. "What can I do?" she asked, her words barely above a whisper. The figure leaned forward, its massive form casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the cavern. "The question is not what you can do, but what you are willing to sacrifice," it said. "To save your world, you must confront its greatest enemy." "And what is that?" Eliza asked, though she feared the answer. The figure's glowing eyes burned brighter. "Humanity itself." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Eliza's mind raced, trying to process what she had just heard. Before she could respond, the ground beneath her began to quake. The cracks in the stone widened, the glowing light within them intensifying. The air grew hotter, almost suffocating, and the hum in the cavern rose to a deafening roar. The figure raised both hands, and the light around it dimmed, casting the cavern into near total darkness. Its voice rang out one final time, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "The warning has been given. The choice is yours." With that, the cavern dissolved around her. The darkness enveloped her completely, and for a moment she felt as though she were falling. Then, with a sudden jolt, she woke up. Eliza was back in her hospital room. The sterile white walls and the hum of medical equipment greeted her, a stark contrast to the cavern she had just left. She sat up, her body trembling, her mind racing. She glanced at the heart monitor beside her bed, its steady beep a reminder that she was alive. But the figure's words echoed in her mind, refusing to be silenced. She had been given a warning, a glimpse of what awaited humanity if nothing changed. The images of destruction and despair were seared into her memory, as vivid as if she had witnessed them firsthand. As she looked out the window, the first rays of dawn breaking over the city, she felt the weight of the message settle on her shoulders. She didn't know what she could do or how she could make a difference, but one thing was clear: the path ahead would not be easy. The ancient figure's final words lingered in her mind, a haunting reminder of the choice that lay before her, the choice that would determine the fate of not just her own life, but the future of the entire world. The first thing Eliza felt was resistance, a pull so strong it felt like the very fabric of her being was caught in a powerful tide. The glowing landscape had long since vanished, replaced by an expanse of shifting shadows and swirling darkness. Every step forward felt like wading through quicksand, the unseen forces around her tugging her deeper into the void. She had no sense of direction, no way of knowing if she was moving closer to an exit or further into the depths of this strange realm. Yet, she pressed on, driven by an instinct she couldn't explain. Something inside her screamed to return, to fight against the gravitational pull of this place. But for every inch she gained, the darkness seemed to respond with more ferocity. Shadows congealed into vague, shifting forms, circling her like predators waiting for their moment to strike. Their presence was oppressive, each movement whispering of malice and despair. She didn't want to look back, afraid of what she might see, but a low growl echoed behind her, primal and guttural, sending shivers through her entire body. Her heart pounded as she risked a glance over her shoulder. In the distance, she saw them, hulking figures with shapes that defied logic, their forms constantly shifting between grotesque shapes and formless voids. Their glowing eyes, pale and unfeeling, locked onto her. They were hunting her. Panic surged, and she pushed herself to move faster. The ground beneath her shifted, becoming slick and unstable. It wasn't solid earth, but something alive, something that pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm. Her foot slipped, and she fell hard, her hands sinking into the strange, gelatinous surface. It burned, not with heat, but with an icy cold that seemed to leach the strength from her limbs. She clawed her way upright, ignoring the sting of tears in her eyes. "I can't stay here," she whispered, her voice trembling. It was the first sound she'd made since entering this nightmarish place, and it startled her. The sound seemed to echo, swallowed quickly by the endless void, but it was enough to remind her of who she was, of the life she had left behind. Eliza forced herself forward again, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know how long she had been running. Time felt meaningless here, but the figures were getting closer, their guttural growls louder, more urgent. The ground beneath her seemed to mock her efforts, shifting and sliding as though trying to trap her. Suddenly, a light appeared in the distance. It wasn't the harsh, glowing expanse she had seen before, but a faint, flickering beacon. It pulsed weakly, as if it could vanish at any moment. Eliza's heart leapt. If there was even the slightest chance that it was a way out, she had to take it. The dark figures seemed to sense her intent. Their movements grew frantic, their forms becoming more defined as they closed the distance. She could feel their presence now, a suffocating weight that pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. But the light was closer, and she refused to give up. With a final burst of energy, she lunged toward the beacon. The moment her hand touched it, the world around her erupted in chaos. The darkness recoiled, screeching in agony as the light expanded, engulfing everything. The ground beneath her shattered, and she felt herself falling, tumbling through an endless void. The shadows clawed at her, their whispers turning to screams, but the light held them at bay. The fall felt eternal. Memories flashed through her mind, her childhood, her friends, the life she had lived, and the moments she had taken for granted. Each memory was a lifeline, pulling her closer to something real, something tangible. She clung to them, using them to anchor herself against the pull of the void. And then she felt it, a warmth spreading through her chest, faint but growing stronger. It was the opposite of the cold, oppressive weight of the afterlife. It was life itself, fragile and chaotic, but undeniably alive. The warmth surged, filling her with a desperate need to return, to fight her way back to the world she had left behind. But the darkness wasn't done with her. As she neared the edge of the void, the shadows surged, their forms twisting and writhing as they launched one final attack. They slammed into her, and for a moment she felt as though she were being torn apart. Pain lanced through her, and her vision blurred. She screamed, a raw, guttural sound that echoed through the void. The light responded. It flared with an intensity that left no room for darkness. The shadows dissolved, their screams fading into silence. The warmth engulfed her completely, pulling her upward, away from the void, and into a blinding brilliance. When Eliza opened her eyes, she was back. The first thing she registered was the harsh, fluorescent light of the hospital room. The second was the sound, the steady beep of a heart monitor and the muffled voices of people around her. She gasped, her chest heaving as if she had been underwater for hours. Her body felt heavy, every muscle aching as though she had just run a marathon. She sat up abruptly, a scream tearing from her throat. The sound startled everyone in the room. Mara, who had been sitting by her bedside, jumped to her feet, her face pale with shock. Eliza's parents rushed to her side, their expressions a mix of relief and fear. "Eliza!" Mara cried, her voice trembling, but Eliza couldn't respond. Her mind was still trapped in the remnants of the nightmare, the echoes of the shadows as whispers lingering in her ears. She clutched the hospital blanket, her knuckles white as she tried to ground herself. The memories of the afterlife were vivid, too vivid to dismiss as a dream. She had been there, and something had chased her, something that wasn't going to let her go so easily. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she looked around the room, her eyes wide with terror. The people she loved were here, alive and safe, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was still watching, waiting for another chance to pull her back. "I'm here," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "I made it back." But deep down, she knew the struggle wasn't over. The afterlife had let her go, but it hadn't forgotten her, and neither had the shadows. Eliza may have come back, but the line between what's real and what's not is starting to fade, and her battle is far from over. The struggle between life and death. Eliza's revival left the hospital in chaos. Nurses and doctors who had seen her flatline hours earlier exchanged bewildered glances. Their clinical training clashed with the undeniable reality before them. She was alive. Machines beeped steadily now, confirming her vitals, but no one dared to explain how it was possible. Eliza's parents clung to each other, their tears of grief replaced by ones of disbelief and joy. Mara stood frozen at the foot of the bed, her wide eyes locked on her friend as though afraid she might disappear again. Eliza, however, felt none of their relief. Her body was here, but her mind still teetered on the edge of the world she had just left. She pressed her trembling hands to her temples, trying to still the whirlwind of memories. The glowing expanse, the shadowy figures, the terrible warning. It was all there, vivid and inescapable. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, the clarity began to slip through her fingers like grains of sand. "Eliza, can you hear me?" Mara's voice broke through the fog. It was gentle but insistent, pulling her back to the sterile brightness of the hospital room. Eliza blinked, her vision focusing on her friend's concerned face. She opened her mouth to speak but found the words stuck in her throat. What could she possibly say? That she'd seen something no living person was meant to see, that the world as they knew it was on the brink of catastrophe? I'm fine," she managed, though her voice was hoarse and unconvincing. It was a lie, and she could see Mara knew it, but how could she explain the inexplicable? The doctors came and went, running tests, asking questions. They poked and prodded, looking for any medical explanation for what had happened. Eliza answered them mechanically, her responses detached and monotone. The more they pressed her, the more her mind recoiled. She didn't want to relive it, to drag those memories into the light where they could be dissected and doubted. That night, when the hospital finally quieted, Eliza's parents went home to rest, leaving Mara to stay by her side. The dim glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows on the walls, and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound. Mara sat in the chair next to her bed, her fingers nervously tapping against the armrest. "Eliza," she said softly, breaking the silence, "I need to know what happened. You weren't breathing. Your heart wasn't beating. And now you're here. Please, tell me." Eliza's chest tightened. She stared at her hands, pale and trembling against the white sheets. The memories were already starting to blur, the details slipping away, but fragments remained, sharp and unyielding. The towering figure, the visions of destruction, the cryptic warning. She wanted to tell Mara, but the words felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You wouldn't understand." Mara's expression hardened. "Try me," she said, her tone more forceful than before, but Eliza shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. The weight of what she'd seen pressed down on her, threatening to crush her entirely. How could she burden Mara with something so incomprehensible, so terrifying? The days that followed were a blur. The hospital discharged her, much to the amazement of the staff, and she returned to her apartment. But nothing felt the same. The familiar comforts of her home, the smell of coffee from the shop below, the soft purr of whiskey on her lap, felt distant, muted. Even Mara's visits, once a source of joy, now filled her with unease. She could see the questions in her friend's eyes, questions she couldn't answer. And then the dreams started. Every night, Eliza found herself back in the glowing expanse, the towering monolith rising before her. The shadowy figures circled her, their whispers filling her ears. But now, their words were clearer, more insistent. "Remember," they said, "the warning must be heard." She would wake drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, the whispers echoing in her mind. It wasn't just the dreams. Strange things began happening around her. Lights flickered when she entered a room. Clocks stopped and started without reason. Once, while washing dishes, she looked down to find the water swirling in patterns that seemed deliberate, as though spelling out words she couldn't decipher. The world felt unstable, as though the veil between realities had thinned and might tear at any moment. Her breakdowns became more frequent. She would find herself crying uncontrollably, her body racked with sobs she couldn't explain. At other times, she would sit in silence for hours staring at nothing, her mind racing with fragmented thoughts. Mara grew increasingly concerned, her attempts to help met with resistance and vague assurances that Eliza was fine. But Eliza wasn't fine. She was unraveling, and she knew it. One night, as she sat on her couch, the TV flickering in the background, a phrase slipped from her lips unbidden. "The balance is broken." The words startled her, and she clapped a hand over her mouth. She didn't know where they had come from, but they felt heavy, laden with meaning. The phrase repeated in her mind, growing louder, more urgent. The next day, she found herself writing compulsively, the words pouring out of her as though guided by an unseen force. Pages upon pages filled with cryptic messages, warnings of disasters and pleas for change. She didn't understand half of what she wrote, but she couldn't stop. Her hands ached, her eyes burned, but the compulsion drove her on. When Mara visited that evening, she found Eliza surrounded by the scattered pages, her eyes wild and bloodshot. "Eliza, what is this?" she asked, picking up one of the sheets. The writing was barely legible, the letters jagged and uneven. Mara read aloud, her voice trembling. "The earth weeps, the skies rage, the end approaches." She looked at Eliza, her face pale. "What does this mean?" Eliza shook her head, her hands trembling. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's just there, in my head. I can't stop it. Mara knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure this out, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. But deep down, both women knew this was something far beyond their understanding. The warning was no longer just a memory. It was a part of her, woven into her very being. And as the days passed, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Eliza felt a deep sense of urgency pressing against her chest, as if time itself was bearing down on her. She couldn't shake the images and warnings she'd seen in that otherworldly realm. The weight of it all gnawed at her, and she knew she had to do something. The message she carried wasn't meant for her alone. It was a warning for everyone. But where could she even begin? The first step was to tell someone, anyone, about what she'd experienced. She started with Mara, hoping her closest friend might understand. Over coffee, in the warmth of the cafe they used to frequent, she recounted everything: the glowing landscapes, the shadowy figures, the terrifying warnings. It all spilled out in a rush, her words tumbling over each other. Mara listened, her face a mask of concern, but the disbelief in her eyes was unmistakable. Eliza, Mara said carefully, as though speaking to someone on the edge of a breakdown. It's a lot to take in. Maybe you should talk to someone, professionally. The words stung, but she forced herself to stay calm. I'm not imagining this, she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Something is happening. I can feel it. Mara's hesitation was answer enough. The divide between them, once barely noticeable, now felt like a canyon. It wasn't just Mara. When she tried to share her experience with her parents, their reactions mirrored her friends. Her mother's worried glances, her father's quiet sighs, they thought she was losing her grip on reality. Even when she pointed to the strange occurrences around them, the unseasonable storms, the sudden spike in bizarre news stories, it wasn't enough to convince them. The world around her seemed to shift in subtle but undeniable ways. Reports of freak weather patterns dominated the news: snowstorms in tropical regions, droughts in places known for their rain. People complained of headaches and nausea, their symptoms unexplained and spreading like a silent epidemic. Birds flew in erratic patterns, their formations broken and chaotic. The air itself felt heavier, charged with an unspoken tension, but no one connected the dots. No one except Eliza. Her frustration grew with each passing day. She turned to social media, desperate to find others who might believe her. She shared her story in long, impassioned posts, attaching photos and articles about the strange phenomena. Her words attracted a mix of curiosity, ridicule, and outright hostility. Some people called her brave, others called her crazy. Trolls flooded her inbox with cruel messages, and her followers dwindled as quickly as they had appeared. Despite the backlash, she refused to stop. The warning burned inside her, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Late at night, she scoured the internet for signs that others might feel what she felt. Forums, conspiracy boards, obscure blogs, she left no stone unturned. That's when she found them. The group called themselves The Watchers. Their website was a plain, unassuming page with cryptic messages and symbols that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. They claimed to monitor anomalies and search for truths hidden from the public. At first, she hesitated. Could they be trusted, or were they just another group of opportunists preying on the desperate? But something about their words resonated with her, and she reached out. The response came within hours. An email, brief and direct, invited her to meet with one of their members. The location was a nondescript coffee shop on the edge of town. Eliza's heart raced as she walked through the doors, scanning the room for her contact. A man in his 40s, with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, sat at a corner table. He raised a hand in greeting when he saw her. "Eliza Reed?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying an edge of curiosity. She nodded, sliding into the seat across from him. "I'm Nathan. I've read your posts. Interesting stuff." "Do you believe me?" she blurted out, unable to contain her desperation. Nathan's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "Let's just say you're not the only one who's noticed," he said, leaning forward. "But you've seen more than most, haven't you? Tell me everything." She hesitated, unsure of how much to share, but Nathan's gaze was steady, patient. Slowly, she began to recount her experience again, this time including the details she'd kept to herself: the towering figure, the cryptic warnings, the visions of destruction. Nathan listened intently, nodding at times, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he sat back, exhaling deeply. "You're right to be worried," he said. "The signs are there, and they're getting worse. But the question is, what are you willing to do about it?" She frowned, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" "The warning isn't just a message," Nathan said. "It's a call to action. If what you're saying is true, then you've been chosen to deliver it. But that's not going to be easy. People don't want to hear the truth, especially when it's inconvenient." The weight of his words settled over her. She had already felt the resistance, the disbelief, the ridicule, but hearing it framed this way made it feel more real, more daunting. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do I make them listen?" Nathan's eyes darkened. "That's the hardest part," he said. "You have to show them, and to do that, you'll need help." The conversation left her reeling. She spent the next few days grappling with the implications of what Nathan had said. Her encounters with the Watchers grew more frequent, their discussions delving into the anomalies they had observed and the evidence they had gathered. They spoke of ancient prophecies, unexplained phenomena, and the delicate balance that held the world together. But the more she learned, the more isolated she became. Her relationship with Mara grew strained, their once easy conversations now filled with tension. "I just want you to be okay," Mara said one night, her voice breaking. "I don't know who you are anymore." She wanted to explain, to make Mara see, but the words wouldn't come. How could she make anyone understand the enormity of what she carried? How could she convince them that the world was on the brink? The signs continued to manifest, each one more unsettling than the last. A massive sinkhole swallowed part of a bustling city. Rivers turned a murky red overnight, baffling scientists. Animals behaved erratically, their migrations disrupted, their calls frantic. The pieces were falling into place, just as the figure in the afterlife had warned, and she knew the worst was yet to come. Eliza uncovers a deeper truth that will change everything, and what she discovers will decide the fate of the world. The world cracks under the pressure. The world around Eliza seemed to crack under the pressure of escalating chaos. The signs she had tried to warn others about were no longer subtle. They were undeniable. Unrelenting heat waves gripped the globe, while sudden violent storms tore through cities with terrifying precision. The news was a constant stream of calamities: rivers drying up overnight, massive flocks of birds falling from the sky, and inexplicable illnesses spreading faster than anyone could contain. People were scared, confused, and yet they still refused to listen. Eliza, however, knew she couldn't stop. The warnings burned brighter in her mind now, refusing to fade no matter how much she wished to forget. Her work with the Watchers had revealed pieces of a problem too large for her to comprehend. Their archives were filled with the reports of similar warnings given throughout history to prophets, seers, and ordinary people who had stumbled into something far beyond themselves. But these warnings were never fully heeded. Each time humanity's pride and ignorance had sealed its fate. She pored over ancient texts and fragmented records, her exhaustion mounting as the pieces began to form a chilling picture. The visions she had seen weren't unique. They were part of a cycle. Time and again, warnings had come before catastrophe, only for history to repeat itself. The figure she'd encountered in the afterlife wasn't some random anomaly. It was part of something vast, ancient, and deeply connected to the world's unraveling. Then came the discovery that changed everything. In one of the Watcher's archives, Eliza found a reference to a global conspiracy, a coordinated effort to suppress knowledge of these warnings. Governments, powerful corporations, and confidential organizations had worked in tandem to erase evidence of past disasters and the warnings that preceded them. The reasoning was insidious: to maintain control, to avoid panic, and to keep the wheels of industry turning at any cost. The disasters weren't accidents or coincidences. They were the inevitable consequences of greed and power. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. The destruction wasn't just foretold, it was orchestrated. And now, as the signs grew more frequent and more severe, she understood that the powers working to suppress the truth were still active. They wouldn't allow her to spread her message freely. The ridicule and isolation she had faced were only the beginning. If she pushed further, they would silence her. But there was more. In the quiet of her sleepless nights, as she pieced together the problem, she began to question the source of her warning. The figure she had encountered, its presence, its cryptic words, the weight of its gaze, had felt overwhelming, but not comforting. What if its intentions weren't entirely benevolent? What if the warning was part of the same cycle, designed not to save humanity, but to ensure its continued suffering? The thought chilled her to her core. Even so, she couldn't stop herself from racing against the clock. The signs were accelerating, and with them, the sense of impending doom. She tracked anomalies and disruptions, noting how they spread like cracks in a fragile dam. Every lead brought her closer to an answer, but also closer to danger. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her, the air thick with an unshakable sense of dread. One night, as she sat surrounded by her notes, a breaking news alert flashed across her screen. A massive earthquake had struck a major city, leveling buildings and leaving thousands dead or missing. The footage was harrowing: streets split open, smoke billowing into the sky, and people screaming as they fled. It was exactly like the visions she'd seen in the afterlife. She knew then that she was running out of time. But the earthquake wasn't just another disaster. As she dug deeper into reports, she uncovered whispers of something buried beneath the city, an artifact of immense power tied to the very warnings she carried. It was a relic mentioned in the Watcher's archives, a piece of an ancient mechanism believed to regulate the balance between worlds. If it had been disturbed, it could explain the sudden escalation of events. She felt the pieces sliding into place, but the picture they formed was even darker than she'd feared. The warning wasn't just a call to action, it was a test, a manipulation. If humanity failed to heed it, the consequences would be catastrophic. But even success might come at a price too great to bear. The weight of the truth pressed down on her, nearly crushing her resolve. She knew she couldn't do this alone, but the divide between her and those she loved had grown too wide to bridge. Mara, her parents, even the Watchers, none of them could fully understand what she was up against. Still, she had no choice but to press forward. The fate of the world depended on it. As she packed her bag, preparing to travel to the epicenter of the earthquake, a single thought lingered in her mind. The figure's warning had led her here, but was it guiding her to salvation or destruction? The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her, each item she added to the bag feeling like a silent question. She wondered if the path would provide answers or merely unravel more of the unknown. With every passing moment, the line between courage and folly blurred, yet she couldn't shake the pull drawing her forward. Was Eliza's warning a glimpse into a terrifying afterlife, or could it be something science has yet to explain? Could there be truths hidden in her chilling message that challenge everything we believe? Tell us what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.